My name My name is Sheila Higginson, and I am the I'm the Operations and Compliance Manager at the Amanuensis Conservation Trust. And before we jump into the presentation, just a couple of housekeeping items to keep things running smoothly this evening. The presentation is being recorded, and that will be available probably in a week or two on ACT's YouTube channel. And we'll be sending you out an email with links to that, as well as some links that Rachelle has asked that we share with everyone. So look for that in your inboxes in a couple of, a week to 2 weeks, probably. We are a little short-staffed at the moment. We do ask that everyone keep their microphone muted during the presentation. And if you prefer to minimize your on-screen distractions, you can turn your camera off or keep it on as you prefer. Towards the end of the presentation, there will be a question and answer session. Couple of ways that you can interact with that is by using the chat function, which I think by this stage in our Zoom careers, we're all pretty familiar with, but you can access that by the panel down at the bottom of your screen. You might need to click on that 3-dot menu that says more to access that, or you can raise your hand using the reactions. So either one of those will work, and myself and Rosalind Page, who is one of ACT's conservation project managers, will be moderating the chat and passing your questions across to Rachelle. So I think that's everything from me. Once again, thank you for joining us. And I'm going to invite Ivan Ash, who is a member of our outreach committee, to do an introduction to Rachelle. So over to you, Ivan.
I met Rachelle and some of her students a few years ago when she was doing water measurements in the Gale River. Looking for how pure the water was, that kind of thing. Rachelle has a wonderful web page on the Plymouth State, so if you want to learn more about her, I was very impressed when I read her page. So I think without any further ado, we'll turn it over to Rachelle.
Well, thank you, Ivan, and thank you everyone for joining us. I'm going to have to check out that page myself because I didn't realize that was still around, and I wonder how up to date it is. But thank you for joining us tonight to talk a little bit about frogs and salamanders. I'm going to share my screen, so I won't be able to see the chat while we're in the midst of things, but fortunately, we have some chat monitors. And thank you, ACT, for hosting me. It's always a pleasure to connect with people who are interested in nature and science and conservation. So I'm going to share my screen here. We should be seeing a presentation view. Oh, there we go. So we're going to talk a little bit about the state of frogs and salamanders, connecting some of the global challenges to our local challenges and opportunities. So first, I figured we would look at the native species of frogs and salamanders in New Hampshire and some of the characteristics of amphibians, and then a little bit about their habitat requirements and their life history, because those habitat requirements and life history features pose some really unique vulnerabilities to frogs and salamanders. And then we'll look at the global scale and the local scale and make some recommendations for how all of us could get involved in the preservation of frog and salamander species, not just here in New Hampshire, but on a broader scale too. And then I'm always happy to answer questions to the best of my ability. But as Sheila mentioned, we'll also send some links to many of the things that I referenced during the presentation. So if you want to dive deeper, we will share more resources. And I'm always happy to connect anyone with even more scientific research. So don't be shy in asking. So spring is a really amazing time for so many reasons. Just before the talk started, we were hearing about some of the wildflowers that are just starting to emerge. And we start to see a lot more bird activity. I actually saw a bear in the backyard last week. So the bears are back and I had to take my bird feeders down. But I am seeing all sorts of wonderful life kind of emerge from the winter hibernation. And frogs and salamanders are a really big part of that. So why are reptiles and amphibians important? Speaking in broad terms, they contribute to our food webs. In fact, frogs and salamanders, all of the amphibians and reptiles, comprise the largest amount of biomass in our state. It's not the moose and the bear, it's actually all those little tiny critters. The juvenile stage of frogs and salamanders help to control some of the pest population. So this is a picture of mosquitoes, which vernal pools are fantastic breeding ground for mosquitoes. But fortunately, if we have strong frog and salamander populations, some of those juvenile frogs and salamanders will be feasting on those baby mosquitoes. And then we can look at frogs and salamanders as indicators of healthy ecosystems. The other reason why it really matters and why we should be paying attention to frogs and salamanders is because if we look at the tree of life, all of the diversity on Earth, it's the branch of amphibians that is being pruned back the most heavily. So we're seeing the most biodiversity loss among amphibians. Because we are actually in our 6th mass extinction. There was a great book that came out a few years ago entitled The 6th Extinction, if you're interested in learning more about that. And like I said, the reptiles and amphibians are the group that's being hit the hardest. And we're tied to this global scale issue right here in New Hampshire in how we manage our lands and then how we can modify some of our behaviors to better protect the frogs and salamanders that are native to this state. Locally, like I said, the frogs and salamanders and those reptiles comprise the largest amount of biomass in our state. And we haven't really felt it yet, but pretty soon those biting insects will be emerging. And then we can be reminded that frogs and salamanders are doing a lot of favors for us when they are feasting on those pest populations. And then, although it's a global issue, I can't stress enough that this is an issue where it's very easy for us to intervene where we are and have a possibility of making beneficial impacts. So some of the threats or the reasons why we're seeing these big population declines among those reptiles and amphibians are disease, and I can talk more about that a little bit further into the presentation. And then the changing of habitat, either degrading the quality of habitat or fragmenting habitats, or draining those wetlands that are critical for some of the life stages of frogs and salamanders. And then I'm sure many of you have seen road mortality of frogs and salamanders, and it's usually that first warm night of the spring when it's raining. So when it's around 50 degrees and it's raining, you might see, if you really start paying attention, lots of frogs and salamanders trying to cross the road under the cover of darkness. And that is a huge vulnerability in their life history. As our roadways get busier and busier, and as we expand our road networks, we're increasing that risk of frogs and salamanders being crushed by car tires as they're moving from one habitat to another. And in the spring, they have a mass migration. Most of the local populations will move during that one big night, that first night where it's around 50 degrees and raining. And then they migrate again in the fall, but it's not one big push where the majority of them move all in the same night. But we definitely see it in the spring. And then we have over harvesting, and you wonder, well, what are frogs and salamanders being harvested for? But they are actually used for medical research, some cuisines, and then there's a robust animal trade. So the trading of wildlife, whether it's legal or illegal, is definitely having an impact on these populations. And then we can add in climate change and shifts in patterns of precipitation, where we get more frequent, intense storms and longer periods of dryness. And then once again, I want to emphasize, with all that doom and gloom, that we have a lot of opportunities to help. So in New Hampshire, we have 40 native species of reptiles and amphibians, and we have 11 snakes. We have 7 turtles, and I highlighted the turtles like that because turtles, we're not going to focus on tonight, but turtles are facing a big challenge, particularly with that illicit animal trade. We have 10 species of frogs. That one in the corner there is a green frog. And we have 12 species of salamander, and that's a familiar one right there that you've probably seen before when you've been taking walks around in these local woods and some of the Act conservation lands. That's the red eft, and they spend part of their life, in fact, it's their juvenile phase, in terrestrial environments. And then when they become adults, they move into the water. Here we have a couple familiar frogs. These are spring peepers, and they have a very distinctive X. I don't know if you can see my pointer. They have a very distinctive X on their back, and that's one of the features you can use to recognize the spring peeper. And they're on the smaller side. Here we have the bullfrog and the green frog. So it's the green frog on the upper half of the screen and the bullfrog in the lower half of the screen. Oh, did I say that wrong? Sorry, it's the bullfrog in the top and the green frog in the bottom. The bullfrog is really distinguished visually by kind of a yellow color on their throat. As you can see, they're pretty similar in their visual features, but their calls are quite distinct. And the green frog has this very pronounced tympanium, or we like to think of it as an ear if we're anthropomorphizing. So a very distinct disc where their ear would be, and then a raised ridge from that tympanium along their back. And that raised ridge along the back is not as pronounced on the bullfrog. And then here's a couple others that maybe are not as familiar. We have the mink frog in the upper corner. And the mink frog is pretty distinctive, not just how it appears visually, but it is very odoriferous. You can usually smell a mink frog before you see them. And then on the bottom of the slide, we have the pickerel frog, which is a beautiful, very distinctively patterned frog. And it's oftentimes mistaken as the northern leopard frog, which is the third frog on this slide in the upper right corner. So when you start to look really close, you can start to see that there are some distinctions between the pickerel frog and the leopard frog. So if you look at the legs in particular, the pickerel frog has almost these bands or stripes of a dark pattern on their legs. And the northern leopard frog has more of a spotted pattern. They are irregular spots, but they are clearly not connected bands like you see on the pickerel frog. And then the leopard frog also has more rounded and irregular spots compared to the pickerel frogs, which are the spots on their back are kind of rectangular and rather regular in how they proceed along the back. And then we can't leave out the toads. So we have two toads native to New Hampshire. We have the American toad, and then we have the Fowler's toad. So the American toad is more common, and the Fowler's toad is actually one of those species of concern because their populations have declined. They look incredibly similar. So the way you tell if you have a Fowler's toad and not an American toad, if you're really practiced in your toad ID, you'll notice that their face on the American toad is a little more elongated, and it's kind of a snubber nose on the Fowler's toad. But the real way to tell is by looking at the warts on its back. And they're not actually warts, they're just raised spots. So on the American toad, you have one or sometimes two raised spots contained within a darker circle. You can detect that darker outline right there. With the Fowler's toad, you have the darker outline of a larger circle, and then you have three or more raised spots. When you start looking, it gets really exciting when you find a toad and you're out there counting spots. You may see me pulled over on the side of the road on a warm, rainy night in the spring, counting spots on toads. So we just looked at a bunch of visual features for identifying frogs, but really the best way to identify a frog, just like with birds, is through their song. So I was going to play a couple of frog calls, and I would invite you, if you would like to identify the frog in the chat. So I'll start with our first one, and if somebody could just give me a thumbs up so I know that you can hear it, that would be fantastic. So here we go. This is our first frog in our frog call quiz. Oh, give me one
Not
second.
hearing anything.
Here we go. Any guesses? That one's a pretty familiar one.
Somebody says a spring peeper. Dee McCowan is saying spring peeper.
And they are right. Absolutely. That's the spring peeper. And hopefully some of us are starting to hear them already this time of year. I've been hearing a few for the past week and a half. Okay, and here we go. Our second one. That's another pretty common one. I would guess that somebody might be identifying that one. Any guesses?
A bullfrog. Oops, we have a bullfrog from Dee again.
Close. Not the bullfrog. I'll play it one more time. So that is the wood frog. And right around this time of year, because there is a little bit of a pattern to when these frogs really start to sing, which is all part of their breeding ritual, we usually first start to hear the peepers. They are some of the early emergers. And then we start to hear that one I just played for you, the wood frog. It's kind of a croaky, it's not necessarily the most beautiful frog song, in my opinion. But it is one that you are probably hearing already, and if not, you'll be hearing it really soon. And then how about we do one more?
Oh, apparently people can't hear them very well.
Oh, okay. Let me see, I'll turn up the volume.
All right, thank you. Not hearing anything.
No?
No. No,
Hearing that?
no.
Oh gosh. Well, I have volume turned up all the way. So that was the northern leopard frog, not that you'd be able to identify it if you couldn't hear it. But I will point out that these recordings are actually on a website called Music of Nature, and they were all recorded by Lang Elliott. I believe he's in New York State. And he has a beautiful collection of all the frog calls. And he actually has them in order on this webpage of when they would be calling. So he starts out with the peepers and then moves into the wood frog and then onto some of these other species. So I would encourage you to check that out if you're interested in training your ear for frog identification by call. And then this screenshot that I have here of all the state's frogs, the 10 native frogs, is on New Hampshire Fish and Game's webpage. And each of these frogs have live links where you can go and check out their conservation status. And they also have those recordings of the frog calls. And then we also have salamanders. Remember, we have 12 native salamanders in the state, and this one I think people get really excited about, but this is the spotted salamander. It's a larger salamander, and it's relatively easy to spot, particularly during that migration period when they are crossing the road. So if you slow down and you think you're seeing a stick in the road, many times on that first warm night of spring when it's raining, it's actually a spotted salamander. But we have other salamanders. So far you've seen the newt, and this is the spotted salamander. And then we have some that are a little more obscure, but if you're vigilant, especially during that migration period, you might see this one, which is the four-toed. And then here's a shot of all 12 of our native salamanders. And they are absolutely beautiful. And some of them are really difficult to ever see because they're a little more discreet than the spotted salamander. Some of their behaviors make them just less likely to be observed by humans, but also most of them are a little smaller. The mud puppy and the spring salamander are on the larger size, but the Jefferson salamander, the blue spotted salamander, the slimy, the northern dusky, and the four-toed are all significantly smaller than that spotted salamander. The marbled salamander is a mole salamander, so it likes to burrow into the ground, and you're most likely to see it in old fields. I have never seen one. It's one of my bucket list goals to see a marbled salamander. And then we have the northern red-backed, which is relatively common, and they spend most of their life in terrestrial environments, whereas all of the others have some phase in their life history where they are aquatic. And here's an up close look at some of those really interesting ones. The spotted salamander, you can identify not just in its adult phase, but if we go look at some vernal pools on Saturday, we may be able to identify spotted salamanders being active in that area by seeing their egg sacs. So that's what we have here on this slide. Just below the spotted salamander is the spotted salamander egg sacs affixed to a little stick floating in a vernal pool. And then we have the blue spotted salamander, and again, that marbled salamander. The Jefferson salamander and the marbled salamander and the blue salamander are all species of concern, if not actually listed as threatened. The Jefferson salamander and the blue spotted salamander, to make things even more complicated, have been interbreeding. So now there's a hybrid salamander. It's called the Jefferson blue spotted salamander. So it starts to get tricky to estimate population sizes when we have to take into account for the fact that evolution is still happening and species are continuing to evolve. And sometimes we get these crosses and eventually maybe entirely new species. So it's not always just species loss, but sometimes new species emerging. And here is an image of a lovely vernal pool. And I love nothing more than spending spring days tromping around in the woods, checking out vernal pools. And this is a really beautiful one that's actually in Plymouth. A lot of times this time of year and in the next couple of weeks, you will see wood frogs. That's the frog down there. And the wood frog is distinctive not only by its call, but it has this sort of dark patch just behind its eye. And you can also find wood frog eggs in these vernal pools. Oops. Vernal pools have some distinctive features. So not every body of water is a vernal pool. It has to be isolated. So there's no inflow or outflow. A vernal pool is usually on the small side. It's not a giant pond or a lake. And it's relatively shallow compared to other surface waters. But perhaps one of the most important features of a vernal pool is that it dries out. So there's a period at some point within every 5 years where that pool dries entirely. And that's really important because if the pool never dried out, other species may begin to colonize, particularly fish. So if you have fish in the body of water in question, it is not a vernal pool. It doesn't mean that there may not be frog or salamander eggs, but it is not a vernal pool if fish are present. The drying out period means that fish wouldn't be able to persist in a vernal pool, and that provides some really big protections for the eggs that are laid in vernal pools and the juveniles, those tadpoles that need an aquatic environment for that period of their life history. If there were fish in there, they'd have to also be surviving the predation from the fish. So being isolated and drying out completely every 5 years helps reduce that potential threat of additional predators. There are species that are considered obligate species to vernal pools. So some frogs and salamanders will not and cannot breed in any other aquatic environment. And then the frogs and salamanders that are hatched in a particular pool have fidelity to that pool. So they will go through their metamorphosis, emerge from the vernal pool in their adult form. So a frog with 4 legs and able to hop moves away from the vernal pool. But then when that adult frog is ready to breed the next breeding season, they go back to the very same vernal pool they were born in. Another picture, this is a vernal pool that is in a very popular park in Plymouth, and a group of students a few years ago decided that they should use that vernal pool as a learning opportunity, and they signed it and then provided some interpretive information about the role of vernal pools and the importance they play ecologically. So vernal pools have many different flavors or types of vernal pools. So the hydro period to be a vernal pool, remember, you have to have at least once every 5 years a total drying out. But some vernal pools will be more ephemeral than others. So they might be really brief and really shallow. And some might have longer cycles of retaining water. So our frogs and salamanders use vernal pools as a breeding habitat, which is very important for their life cycle. But like I mentioned before, once they've matured into their adult phase, they move away from that vernal pool. And sometimes, depending on the species, they will make use of permanent wetlands or rivers and streams. And some of those upland areas in the forests and rocky slopes, or old fields, like the marbled salamander is more likely to be found in an old field. So maintaining that habitat diversity is really important for maintaining the species diversity. And then not just maintaining the habitat diversity, but maintaining the connectivity across these habitats. So this is a little bit of the life history of our frogs, and the image in the top right corner kind of shows seasonally which frogs are emerging and active in their breeding period. So it starts early with the peepers and the wood frogs, and then later in the spring you have the leopard and the pickerel frogs, and then a little bit later along come those American toads and Fowler's toads. And the American toad, interestingly, has a very beautiful song. And then the latest in the seasonal breeding period, you have the mink frog and the bullfrog that you'll start to hear as we transition from spring into summer. So like I mentioned before, we don't have to see just the adult form to be able to identify if any of these species are present in a particular location. So we can look at vernal pools and see what types of egg masses are there to understand the species that might be present and might be dependent on that vernal pool. And if you go on the walk on Saturday, we'll spend time identifying different egg masses and looking at the characteristics, if they are a glob of individual eggs, or if they are a glob of eggs surrounded by some gelatinous outer coating that holds them all together, and whether or not they're attached to something or free floating. So again, those vernal pools are really important for that breeding period, when the adults go back from where they were born, breed, and lay their eggs. And then those eggs hatch and they go through the tadpole phase. And eventually, as they become adults, they leave the pool, oftentimes having to cross the road. So this is an image of a pickerel frog crossing the road. This was last spring at a migration hotspot, where some students were helping to usher frogs and salamanders across the road in hopes that they would make it on their way without being run over. As they emerge in their adult phase, they move to their summer foraging grounds. So those upland forest habitats, those old fields, are where they will spend the summer into the fall, just eating as much as they can. And then once summer starts to wind down and the leaves start to fall, the frogs and salamanders migrate back, oftentimes, once again, across roadways to a place a little bit closer to their vernal pool. They don't go back to the vernal pool to overwinter, but they move a little closer to that vernal pool and find a nice spot to overwinter. And then in the spring, when it gets warm enough and the conditions are right and they emerge from their hibernation, they don't have too far to go to get to the breeding pond. So the northern leopard frog we'll take, for example, we just don't have enough resources in the state of New Hampshire to really have a good handle on the frog and salamander populations. So as many of you probably know, New Hampshire Fish and Game doesn't receive any money from the general funds. Their budget comes from the sale of hunting and fishing licenses. So the non-game program in particular at Fish and Game has fairly limited resources. And they rely on volunteers and citizen scientists to help understand species occurrence within our state. So they ask for us to go out and look for frogs and take pictures and then share that data, frogs and salamanders, I should say. And then they can generate these species occurrence maps. So the darker each geometric shape here is, each polygon is a town, and the darker gray is where the northern leopard frog has been identified between 1994 and 2014. And then the lighter gray identifies where the northern leopard frog may have been found in the past, but was not found after 1993. You can see that there's a lot of historic range of northern leopard frog. I think this is Bethlehem right here, which isn't reporting any current presence of northern leopard frog as far as up to 2014. So I pulled the most recent species occurrence map for the northern leopard frog, and these are up to date as far as 2021. And again, you can see that there's actually even fewer of the dark gray towns. So we're seeing fewer northern leopard frogs, or we're not able to look quite as much. So there's two possible things here. The populations have declined, or we have fewer volunteers and not enough resources to get out there and look. So it could be that there's fewer, or it could just be that we're not looking enough or as much. So we have some limited awareness of the ecological role that many of these frogs and salamanders play. So there's still need for additional research. And we need a little bit more information about how to best steward the frog and salamander populations that remain. And we need to understand better the human impacts at the local and the global levels. So if you are on, this is a screenshot from New Hampshire Fish and Game's webpage on frogs, and I screenshotted the page for the northern leopard frog. You can see that the leopard frog, the northern leopard frog, is a species of special concern. It's been identified as one of those species in greatest need of conservation. So there's concern about the northern leopard frog. It's vulnerable to extirpation, so not being a resident of the state anymore, or potentially going entirely extinct. They will give you, for all of the 10 frog species, a description of what they look like, what they might be confused with, their preferred habitat types, and when you most likely would be seeing them in those habitats. So it's a beautiful resource. It's very accessible, and I think it's really well organized. So if you have a favorite frog or salamander, you could hop on to the New Hampshire Fish and Game website and find out a little bit more. If we zoom out for a moment and think about the global scale challenges for reptiles and amphibians in particular, loss of biodiversity is one of the major concerns of our modern era. As I said already, the highest rates of extinction are among reptiles and amphibians. And then in New Hampshire, we just don't have enough information, sort of baseline species occurrence data. And that's where we need more citizen science to help fill in some of those information gaps. So locally, we need a little bit of help with the mapping of species occurrence, and also those habitats, in particular, vernal pool habitats, which are critical for that reproductive phase. And then if we can help identify migration hotspots, communities could come together to reduce some of that road mortality, because conveniently, the frogs and salamanders tend to migrate all at once on one night each spring. So if we could inconvenience ourselves and limit our driving near these migration hotspots for one night each spring, we could potentially have a lot of benefit for preserving the frog and salamander populations. And then as we start to learn more and more about the role of disease and climate change and illicit animal trade, we have new and emerging opportunities to be stewards of the habitats and the species. This is from Our World in Data, which is a platform that I absolutely love, because you can check out all kinds of statistical information about pretty much anything in our world that you find of interest. So I think this is a fantastic tool for helping us understand and learn more facts about the populations of wildlife in particular on this side. So if we think about biodiversity declines, frogs and salamanders, or those reptiles, amphibians, are not always the first thing that come to mind. It's those charismatic megafauna like moose and polar bear, which are very important. But it's really those amphibians you see that are having the greatest population declines. I did want to point out that this particular slide talking about wildlife population declines is talking about biodiversity loss of animals, but we're not looking at all of the animals. It's excluding insects and corals. And then we're not even touching the other kingdoms of fungi and plants on this slide. And we are seeing biodiversity losses in those kingdoms as well. So the big threats to species population is really that habitat loss and fragmentation. So sometimes habitat quality is being degraded, or sometimes the vernal pool habitats in particular, and those wetlands that are quintessential during different life phases, are being lost altogether. And sometimes we're just creating new barriers that are big challenges for migratory species. So we're talking about frogs and salamanders, but this holds true for other migratory species. And then overharvesting, pollution, climate change, and invasive species that outcompete and or spread disease. So frogs are not especially fragile. In the links that you get after tonight, there's a link to this article here about how more than 30% of amphibian species are at risk of imminent extinction. But frogs are pretty hardy. In fact, they survived the extinction event that wiped out the dinosaurs. They survived the Industrial Revolution, but they do have some characteristics that make them particularly vulnerable. So having this permeable skin makes them very vulnerable to chemical pollutants, but also to this particular disease called chytridomydosis. You may have heard of it referred to as chytrid fungus. So that permeable skin means that it's pretty easy for disease to infect these amphibians. They also have that need for different habitats at different phases in their life history. So even if the aquatic habitats are maintained in pristine condition, when we have terrestrial habitats being degraded, that can impact frog and salamander populations too. So it's really about conserving and protecting the quality and connectivity of both the aquatic and terrestrial habitats, because they are migratory species. And that process of migration leads to lots of vulnerabilities. In particular, for our frogs and salamanders in New Hampshire, it's road mortality. So getting squashed as they are on their way to and from their vernal pool habitats. But the other big thing at a global scale is the rate of change is really taking its toll on reptiles and amphibians. So human activity has changed our climate faster and more dramatically than it has ever changed naturally. And combining these stressors and threats of habitat loss, changing precipitation and temperature regimes, increased potential exposure to pollutants, all of those stressors and threats together are really doing damage to these populations. So we have disease, the habitat challenge, road mortality, and pollution. I know these are kind of gruesome photos, so we won't stay long, but I'm happy to tell you a little bit more about disease in particular. So we have chytrid fungus, and this is being seen as a pandemic that is responsible for declines of about 500 amphibian species, and it's thought to have caused the extinction of at least 90 species of amphibian. And it's largely spread by the international trade of frogs and salamanders. So in particular, we have a robust legal trade of the North American bullfrog, which is farmed for frog legs. And then we also have a robust trade in the African clawed frog, which is heavily used for medical research. And there's just an important note that those things aren't necessarily horrible or bad, but there is a big responsibility to manage those frog farming operations and the distribution of frogs for medical research with very strict adherence to keeping them contained, because any escapees are potential disease carriers that could infect local wild populations. So chytrid fungus actually causes a disease of the skin where it hardens the frog skin. And remember that that permeable skin is how they get and discharge nutrients and compounds. So that permeable skin takes in nutrients and excretes waste. When you have the hardening or the keratinizing of their skin, they're no longer able to take in the nutrients that they need or excrete the waste that they need, and it ultimately leads to mortality. So some of the Plymouth State University students worked on mapping vernal pool habitats and testing local frog populations for chytrid fungus. So we spent a couple summers catching frogs, which ironically is what I did in my summers as a child. So it's quite fun, actually. They did a lot of work to catch frogs and do a lot of outreach with mostly elementary school students. And when we would catch these frogs, we would swab them with a big giant Q-tip and then use that sample to run PCR testing, just like with COVID testing. It's polyamylase chain reaction testing to identify the presence of chytrid fungus disease. So we would swab frogs and then run the tests in the lab, and it turns out that chytrid is here. And in fact, it was about 50% of the frogs we swabbed had chytrid. And the students did a lot of work to educate the greater Plymouth community about some of these steps we could take to help protect frog and salamander populations. And I would mention that tomorrow is a big day. In fact, it's the 15th annual Save the Frog Day, which is a global celebration of frogs. And as we start to wrap up, I just wanted to leave you with a couple of points about just how empowered we are to protect the frogs and salamanders in our area. So first and foremost, not driving on those warm spring nights when it's raining, so that we avoid running them over. And then if you wanted to get even more actively involved, communities could organize crossing brigades. So small teams of people at migration hotspots during that peak migration period to usher those critters across the street. There's other communities that have been doing this for many years, and it's shown to be pretty successful. Of course, there's some best practices to help not spread disease, but it is a fun way to get engaged in stewardship. And then also documenting some of those critical habitats and migration hotspots with people like myself and or New Hampshire Fish and Game directly, so that we can really target some of the resources for protecting those habitats and intervening for migration protection with whatever resources we may have available to us. So maybe creating safe wildlife crossings or pulling together some of those volunteers to host a crossing brigade during the big migration event. And then another way to have some intervention at that global scale is to advocate for stronger penalties and more enforcement to stop illegal and illicit wildlife trade, which I frankly never realized just how significant of a problem this is, but it truly is. And in fact, some of our 7 native New Hampshire turtles are facing extirpation or extinction, largely due to poaching. So people collecting them from the wild and then selling them. And I think I'll stop there. I encourage all of you to consider being a citizen scientist to help document some of these species. And there are some really easy ways to do that. If you have a smartphone, it's as easy as snapping a picture and submitting it to the New Hampshire Wildlife Sightings webpage. And I am happy to open this up for questions or comments. And I was just going to leave you with this beautiful quote from Robin Wall Kimmerer, author of Braiding Sweetgrass, where she just reminds us that we actually have a lot of opportunity for restoration. And these acts of restoration can be really beneficial for habitats and wildlife and us.
Thank you, Rachelle. I did pop those links that you shared in the chat if people want to do a screenshot of those. And as mentioned, they will be sent out via email at some point. So we do have a few minutes left, not a whole lot of time. If anyone has any questions, I'm sure Rachelle would be happy to tackle those. So you can either pop them in the chat or raise your hand, and maybe I have the technology and the competence to see a raised hand, but maybe not.
I do have a question, Rachelle. What is sort of the range that a geographic range that a frog would move around in? I mean, I see toads way up on the top of my hill, behind my house, which is, it's thousands of feet from a water source.
Mhm.
What sort of geographic range do they have?
That is a fantastic question. And there's research that really just came out about 3 years ago where they put little geolocators on frogs so that they could track them to answer exactly that question, because it was a big mystery for a long time. And some of the most ambitious will move about 2 kilometers.
Wow. Wow. That's a lot for a little creature like that. And what is sort of their life expectancy?
I don't have an answer for that. And I don't know if anyone does, because it's been difficult to track them in the wild to see individual persistence. But I could probably pose that question to some folks who are far more informed than I am and see what they share.
You talked about the fact that they go back to their natal vernal pond, vernal pool for breeding and laying their eggs. So they must at least a year, maybe.
Oh,
2
yes. Yes, they definitely persist through multiple breeding seasons. Yes.
Thank you. Are there any other questions that anybody has? So maybe just jump in.
So I have one question from Mary. Will frogs and amphibians populate a newly formed vernal pool?
Yeah, so that fidelity to their home pool is ideal, but it's not always what they adhere to. So yes, when there is good habitat, you are likely to see it colonized. And you can see this in places like if there's a big development of a retail facility and they have to have these sort of artificial pools to maintain excess water runoff, you'll see it oftentimes being colonized with green frogs and bullfrogs. Yep.
And Dee says, thank you for a depressing but hopeful presentation. And she said she shared a link to a fun site to listen to amphibian calls that,
Great.
again, people can do a screen grab of that if they're interested. So I am not seeing any more questions. I do not see any raised hands, and we are just coming up to 7 o'clock. So again, thank you so much, Rachelle, for sharing your expertise and knowledge with us. And I'm excited as kind of we finish our overwintering to get out into the woods and wetlands and explore some vernal pools. So thank you so much to everyone for joining us. And I'm sure you'll see some people at the walk on Saturday, which is
Excellent.
full. So we can start a wait list for that, but currently it is full.
Great.
So thanks everyone,
so
and have a great night. And thanks again for joining us.
Good night.
Thank you.